Hi, and welcome back to day 5 of the Augusta video sew along. I hope you have everything cut and prepped because it's time to start sewing. In today's lesson, we'll start by applying our fusible interfacing, then we'll assemble and attach our lapels to the front of our Augustas. Go ahead and heat up your iron and thread your machine, and let's get to it. Before we do anything else, we're going to apply our fusible interfacing to both of our lapel pieces and the upper collar. Even though we won't be working with the upper collar today, I like to fuse everything at once. That way, I don't need to keep tabs on my cut interfacing pieces, and I only need to get my press cloth out once. Since you're essentially gluing something to your fabric when you apply fusible interfacing, you're going to want to make sure you place a cloth underneath your fabric to keep glue off your ironing board cover. You'll also need something between the interfacing and the iron, so you don't end up with glue on your iron sole plate. I use a piece of muslin for this. In most cases, when you purchase your interfacing, it will come with instructions on how to apply it to your fabric. If there are, you'll want to follow those. If not, you might need to do a bit of testing with your fabric and fusible to determine the best method for application. Here's how mine adheres. Start by laying out your muslin on top of your ironing board cover. Then find the piece you're going to fuse, lay that out, and give it a press. Now there are 2 lapel pieces, and if you remember when we cut our interfacing, we cut it with the glue side facing up. So the glue dots go down towards the wrong side of the fabric, and that is how you know which one to fuse. It will only fuse to one because they are not the same, they're opposite of the same piece. So place your interfacing with the glue side down on top of your pattern piece. Cover it with your press cloth. And then you're going to press down so the heat melts the glue to the fabric. And I don't use steam with my interfacing. Again, it's going to depend on the instructions for yours. Then lift your iron and place it back down. You don't want to slide back and forth because that will move the interfacing on top of the fabric. So just work across until the entire thing is fused. Remove your press cloth and check that you've got everything stuck down. Then you can remove your piece, and we'll repeat that for the other lapel. Now again, for the left lapel, we have 2 opposite pieces. Take your interfacing, find the glue side down, and you can see that only aligns to one. So remove the other lapel. I'm going to just center that and make sure my fusible is aligned. Cover it, and then press. All right, everything is glued. And there you have your interfacing. Now we also need to fuse our upper collar. This is a symmetrical piece, so it doesn't matter which way it's laid out. Place your interfacing down, glue side to the wrong side of the fabric. Oops. Cover it, and then press. Now our upper collar is fused and you are done fusing, so you can pack up your press cloth and it's time to assemble our lapels. The first thing we need to do is assemble our left lapel. So take your 2 lapel pieces, you have the fused and the non-fused. And we're just going to lay one on top of the other with the right sides together. We're then going to sew from your match point here that we marked to the corner, pivot, and then sew down. So you just pin along that edge. Then again, we're going to head over to the machine, sew from our match point over to the corner, pivot, and sew down. Lift your presser foot. And align your needle with your match point. And we're going to sew using our 1/2 inch seam allowance. Pivot. Make sure you remove your pins as you get to them. And sew down to the lower edge. Now that we have this sewn, we're going to remove our thread tacks if we have them. All right, our thread tacks are gone. All right, we now need to trim our seam allowance. We're going to cut across this point here. We're going to clip into the point where we started sewing. To, but not through that point. And then we're going to grade the seam allowance of the interfaced lapel. So just cut that in half. All right, so our seam allowance is now graded, our corner is cut, and we have clipped into the point where we started sewing. Now we need to grab our irons, and we're going to press our lapel so the right side is facing out. Turn your point. And you may need a point turner for this part. Here I have my bone folder. Just put that in and manipulate that to get a sharp corner. At the point where you clipped, the seam allowance is going to lay flat out. So press along your seam line. All right, now we have our lapel right side out. Now open your lapel so the fused side is face down onto your ironing board. We're going to press the seam allowance along this edge to the wrong side. So that's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I just like to give everything one more nice press. So here we have our lapel. The fused side has the raw edge of the seam allowance turned under, a 1/2 inch. We are ready to attach this to our bodice. All right, now here we have our left lapel, and this is, when you're wearing it, the left side of the shirt. So we're going to align the raw edge with the edge of the lapel. And you can see this match point at the bottom here will match this match point. So that's your the first thing you're going to align. Then you're going to align the top edge. Sorry, it's hard to pin the other way. And I like to just put a pin or two in between. All right, now you're going to head over to your machine and you're going to sew from the top down to this match point. All right, now that we're at our machine, we'll raise our presser foot. You're going to stop at that match point, back tack, and clip your threads. All right, now that your lapel is attached, you're going to grade the seam allowance by cutting the seam allowance of the lapel in half. I've done that already. So there you can see we now have our lapel edge cut in half, the seam is graded, and now we're going to press the lapel away from the body. Now don't do this with the lapel folded. Make sure that this fused side is free and doesn't get stuck in anything. Then you're just going to press, and you can continue pressing along the seam line down to the raw edge. Now you're going to turn your shirt over, and you can see this isn't going to want to fold here. So what we need to do is we need to cut into our match point, to but not through. And I find this easiest to do from the back because you can really see exactly where you stop stitching. Now your lapel is freed. Lay it out nice and flat. All right, so you can see how nice that lays once we've clipped into it. So you're going to fold the lapel over and make sure that your edge meets or just slightly passes that seam line there, because we're going to sew from the front to stitch this into place. So pop a few pins in there. Make sure you don't pin it to your ironing board, which I have been known to do. Nope, almost got it there. I'm just going to do one more. And then we're going to head over to the machine. All right, So you can see a little better on the front. We're just going to stitch from this match point on the lapel, just right next to your seam line, up to the top to make sure that your back is closed. And you do not want to catch this while you're stitching, so just the lapel. All right, so we're at our machine, and again, we do not want to catch the bottom of our shirt. We're just stitching the lapel. And we're going to stitch right along this edge through both layers of the lapel. So I like to sink my needle. Make sure you remove your pins before you get to them. I do a little back tack, and then you're done. Now we're going to need to fold the lapel along the roll line. We have this angled edge at the bottom here, and if you fold those edges together, it should naturally fold along the fold line. If you're worried that it's not quite on the fold line, you don't feel like it's lining up, something might have cut wrong, just grab your pattern piece and you can fold it along the roll line, which is also the grain line. Then align it with your lapel. The bottom point will line up and the top as well, because there is nothing sewn here. You still have the seam allowance. And you can just fold it along the roll line that way. And then I like to give it a light press. Nothing too hard, just to kind of crease that into there. And then we're going to sew across this bottom edge here within the seam allowance, only through the lapel. You do not want to catch here. We're just going through the lapel. So let me put a pin in there. We'll head over to the machine and do that. All right, here we are at the machine, our lapel, and we're again just sewing through the lapel within the 1/2 inch seam allowance. You don't really need to back tack if you don't want to. I'll just do one. Remove your pin. And then head back over to the table. Now the reason we just stitched across that is to anchor this in place, and the light press also helps. So now I'm going to remove the ironing board, and you're going to lay your front out with the wrong side facing up. Then fold. Once your lapel is folded down, this edge here is going to align with the base of your lapel. You're going to pin through the shirt and the lapel, and I'll show you this from the front in a second. And we're going to stitch from the edge of the lapel to this match point here. And then from the front, what that looks like is we're stitching from this point over to this match point here. So let's head over to the machine. All right, lay your shirt out, and I'm going to stitch with the lapel down. I'm going to remove my pin right away because you're going to get to that very quickly. Make sure everything is nice and flat, and we're just going to sew from here over to where we clipped. And I am going to back tack. Now you can see after we've stitched this doesn't want to lay flat, and that's because we need to clip into the point where we just stitched to. So we'll just clip from here right to where we stop stitching. Now you can give your lapel area a nice press. And we'll set this aside to assemble our right lapel. All right, now the right lapel is very similar to how we did the left. There's just a few differences. So we're going to start by placing our two lapel pieces right side together. You can see, right sides together. And then we're going to pin, starting at the match point along the top edge, down, along the lapel, across the bottom, and up this side to our match point here. So when we head over to the machine, we're going to start sewing here, pivot, sew down, pivot, sew across, pivot, and sew up to our match point here. So let's head over to the machine and do that now. So I'm going to start by sinking my needle through my match point, removing my pin. I am going to back tack. Pivot. You want to be as exact as possible with this bottom. So as I get close, I usually pivot slightly, and now I'm not quite a full stitch away. So I'm going to force that one, pivot, and then sew up to the match point. Back tack and clip. Then head back over to your ironing board. All right, the next thing we're going to do is trim our corners. And then we're going to clip into, but not through, the seam line at our match points. Now we need to grade our seam allowances, and we're going to do that by cutting the seam allowance of the fused lapel in half. This is easier to do when I'm not filming. All right. So now that that is fused, we need to flip our lapel right side out. So I like to start by, you're not going to be able to get the iron all the way in here, but I like to start by just pressing along this edge a little bit, as much as I can. Then you're going to need to flip your corners right side out. And I like to do this little, I don't know, you've probably noticed me doing this, but if you put your nail into the corner and then grab it with your other nail, then flip it, it gives you a pretty sharp point right off the bat. Here you can see, like, that's pretty sharp for just flipping it. You're also going to want to remove your lower match points, and then we're going to need to press along our stitched edge. All right, so where you clipped, the seam allowance is going to lay flat, and then just carefully press along the edge to get a nice flat seam line. And you want the seam line to just fall between the two. You don't want it to roll to one side or the other for this. Get that nice and crisp. We're going to press along the bottom and try to make that as flat as possible. See, nice and straight. Then we're going to angle up. And press that final edge. Now again, we're going to press our seam allowance under along the fused edge. So here it falls in line with what we've already stitched. You're just going to press the rest of the 1/2 inch seam allowance under. So there you have that edge pressed under. So grab your shirt and let's attach this to our Augustas. All right, you're gonna lay your shirt out with the right side facing up. There's a notch here along this longer edge, so start by matching that point. After you've matched your notch, this point where you clipped here will align with this match point here. So that's your second place you want to pin. And then the final place is up at the top. Then I like to just put a pin between those just because I don't want things moving around while I'm sewing the neckline. Then we're going to head over to our machine and we're going to sew along this line from the top down to the match point. Again, our 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, now we're back at our machine. We're going to attach our right lapel to our neckline. So starting at the top, back tack, remove your pins as you get to them, and stitch down to the match point. And one thing I forgot to mention is I like to just make sure that the bottom is supported since we are working with a neckline, so don't let it drag down below your machine. Now here we are getting into that match point. So I'm just moving this lapel out of the way slightly. I'm not stretching anything, just keeping it clear. You're just sewing right to that point, not past it. Back tack and remove. So here you can see the lapel starting to come together. We're going to once again clip into where we stopped stitching. We're now going to press the lapel away from the shirt, just like we did for the left. When you get down to this edge, just make sure you're not pulling. If you pull, it can kind of start to fall out of line. And a nice smooth edge there. Now once your lapel is pressed, we're going to align the bottom edge. So I have removed the thread tacks because they fell on these dots and you couldn't really see them. So these pins are now where our match points are. So we're going to align our lapel. You might need to just shift it slightly so that the two edges hit the two match points. Then you're going to pin it in place. And try not to pin it to your ironing board. I'm going to put a pin right where you can see our lapel is free because I don't want that to move while I'm stitching. I like to put one through the bottom. And we're going to need to pin up around through our lapel line here. We're going to stitch along the lapel line. So this is our match point. I've put a cross mark here and I've just drawn the lapel in. If you are going to do this, make sure you use something that will come out. I hope this comes out, but if not, it was worth it for you guys. And I'm just gonna put a pin in there. And then I'm also gonna just pin right through the whole pile of everything up out of the way, just to keep things closed up. Now after that, flip it so the wrong side is facing up. All right, now here you can see the wrong side is facing up. It comes through this point very nicely, and our folded edge just hits our stitching line. So adjust this edge if you need to, but you want it to hit or just cover that stitching line. So you're going to pin that in place. And one more. Then we're going to need to stitch our lapel down. To stitch the lapel in place, I find it easiest to start at the shoulder, come down, work across, up, and end here. But if you find it easier to start here and go down, you can do that too. It doesn't really matter. So let's head over to our machine. And just a quick note, if you found that things shifted around while you were working, maybe your markings weren't that exact, you want this point to stop where the lapel is underneath, so you can see the lapel is right there. So just stop stitching at the lapel. All right, so here we go. We're going to stitch right next to our seam line on the lapel edge. I'm going to do a tiny back tack. And I don't use an edge stitch for this. An edge stitch foot, because at one point when we turn at the bottom, we are not stitching over an edge, and I find it really awkward. So if you want to use an edge stitch foot, then I recommend breaking your stitching line before you turn. Now when you get to the bottom, you're going to need to pivot. Stitch across the lower edge. And I'm just going to hand wheel onto the roll line. We're going to turn and we're going to just stitch straight up to our point. Now I do back tack here. Clip your threads. While we're at the machine, we're just going to sew these two layers of the lapel together so they act as one. So I just do this within the seam allowance, so I use about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then on the other lapel. Then head back over to the table and we will finish up our lapel. All right, so here you can see our lapel is attached, and you can give it a light press along the roll line again. And then the last thing we need to do is flip it so the wrong side is facing up. So here on the back you can see we have this little hole. So all I do for that is I just whip stitch it closed. And you're only going to go through the back layer of the lapel. Don't go through both layers or you'll see it from the front. Tie it off. And clip your threads. And here you can see the finished lapel. That was not so hard. Alright, so that is it for attaching your lapels. The first day of sewing is by far the most difficult for this pattern, and I have a feeling you crushed it. Now that that's out of the way, it's just going to be smooth sailing. Stay tuned for our next lesson where we'll be sewing up the darts and prepping the back to attach the yoke. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any of our video lessons. Have a great day, and I'll see you back here next time. Bye.